Today I'd like to talk with you about God's will. When I worked in the parish for about 6 years, it seemed to me this was a primary issue for many parishioners. They wanted to know what God's will was for them. They were searching for that meaning in life so they could be assured that they were doing the right thing and that they were truly in line with the larger purposes of God. Far too often I had a sense that people were thinking that God's will was sort of like a pirate's map, that somehow there was, one way to get to it, and there was only one treasure, if you will, buried in a secret spot, and that somehow you had to know where the big tree was that you had to take 5 paces to the right from, and then the big rock that you took 6 paces to the left from, and then there would be the X would mark the spot, and you'd begin to uncover what God's will was. Well, if we think about what is God's will, I think we have to think about what, in fact, does God desire for us. He desires happiness, is the classic definition of why did God make us or create us. And we think about that, how do we find happiness? I think what underlies that is to live in God. As first letter of John in chapter 4, verse 16 says, God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in them. So it seems that God's will is that we live in love. And I think we should think of, therefore, what is God's will as being not the pirate's treasure map, but rather being a landscape of love. And there's probably 1,000 different paths to that goal of love. And the true trick, therefore, is not to find the pirate's map, but rather to find a way to make decisions, choices in life that, in fact, are more loving, that lead us to the fuller vision of God's embrace. And so what we want to do today, as we talk about discernment, then, how do we discern what is the more loving choice? How do we discern God's will? How do we discern the path of our life? I'd like to use or discuss two tools from spirituality that I think are helpful. These come from Ignatian spirituality. And I don't know if you know it or not, but Father Leo John de Hone, the founder of the Priests of the Sacred Heart, was very influenced by Ignatian spirituality. He made the spiritual exercises, which is this 4-week retreat that can be delivered in a couple different formats, but this intensive experience in which the retreatant encounters God in a profound way to give direction to their life. Well, Father de Hone underwent the spiritual exercises a number of times in his life, and you can see the elements of Ignatian spirituality very present within his spirituality. And in fact, Priests of the Sacred Heart like to say, because their initials are SCJ, and the C in the middle stands for core, which is the Latin for heart. And if you know Jesuits, who since St. Ignatius founded the Jesuits, their initials are SJ for Society of Jesus. So Priests of the Sacred Heart, since they have the same 2 letters, S and J, which surround the C, they like to say they're Jesuits with a heart, in fact. So therefore, as we talk about, although I'm going to focus on Ignatius, really this is an exposition or relevant to de Honian spirituality as well. So the 2 tools I want to talk about are the tools of consolation and desolation as a spiritual framework in making a choice, and particularly a major life choice. And then a second tool would be a prayer method called the Examine of Consciousness, or simply the Examine. So 2 tools, the consolation, desolation, spiritual framework for making a choice, and then the prayer method of the Examine. And both these relate to discernment. How do we discern God's will? So let me begin with this consolation and desolation, and enter this topic through St. Ignatius' own story. St. Ignatius grew up in a noble family in Spain, and he had aspirations to be a swashbuckling knight who would woo the ladies and pursued that path, in fact, wanting to be in the court of the king and be famous and well-known and honored. And he was pursuing that path when he was defending a fortress at Pamplona, a castle, and what do you know but a cannonball ripped into his leg. Now the French, since Loyola was on the Spanish side, the French who then did capture the castle bound his leg up and sent him back to his hometown in Loyola in Spain. But Ignatius was not happy about how the French doctors had set his legs, because they hadn't set it right, and there's a little bulge. His leg actually protruded. And so he was worried about this, because if he goes back to court, not only would he have a limp, but then those tights that those were all the rage at that time would show this bulge in his leg. And how is he going to woo the ladies and be a swashbuckling figure if he has this deformed leg? So therefore he had the doctors there in Loyola to saw off the hump and reset the leg. And hard to believe, this is the day before anesthetic, before antibiotics, very risky procedure to be performed. That's how much pride he had. But in fact, they did it. Well, but it required a long convalescence. And as he sat there in the castle with nothing to do before you had your video games and TV, he said, well, are there any books I can read? And all that was available was a book on the life of the saints and a life of Christ. And he said, no, I'm not looking for that. I want a romance novel. I want, something more exciting and entertaining. But finally, out of boredom, since there was nothing else available, he read both of those books. And something interesting happened. Because after he'd read the books, let's say about St. Francis, he would meditate on and think, what would it be like to be St. Francis, to give my life that radically to Christ and live to serve the poor? And then other times he would return to his other daydreams, his more common daydreams about becoming a famous person within the court, wooing the ladies back in the power centers of Spain. And he noticed a difference as he reflected, as he's had a lot of time, on what happened during those daydreams. He noticed that in both cases, he was energized and excited and somehow got a good feeling, let's say even of joy, whether he was reflecting on being like St. Francis or being a knight. But the difference he noticed was that after he stopped actively daydreaming about one lifestyle or the other, when he was done daydreaming about being a saint like St. Francis, he was more at peace. He was more in balance emotionally. He was more at ease. He was calmer, and yet he was, at the same time, he was still energized. He felt more refreshed. He felt more invigorated. And he called that consolation. He was more consoled. In contrast, as he thought back to going to be returned to his former life, as he meditated or daydreamed about becoming a knight again, he felt good during the moment, but the difference was, after he's done actively imagining those things, he felt unease. He felt lack of energy, maybe even a little out of sorts. And he called that desolation. Now notice, in both cases, in the midst of thinking about either one of those choices, he was consoled. The question was the effect it had after he stopped actively reflecting upon it. And if it persisted, that sense of consolation, of joy, of balance, and of energy, then he called that consolation. If it ended and was instead replaced after the act of daydreaming with a sense of dissatisfaction and some sort of dis-ease, then he called that desolation. And he came to the decision that God was in the midst of that was the spirit moving within his life, and that therefore it was a way of helping him determine how God was calling him to live his life. Now, he will say, and does say, that in fact it could have been reversed, that he would have gotten a sense of consolation to be a knight, and that would have been his calling then. That's what he should have done. And he might have felt less of that energy and that balance when he thought about being giving everything up and following Christ like St. Francis. And so therefore, that kind of choice of how to live one's life would not be how the Spirit was active in his life. So it's not as if he was talking here about choices between good or bad. That's not the issue. The question is a choice between two goods, which is actually the harder choice for us. In fact, St. Ignatius would say that if it's a choice between a good and a bad, there's no discernment involved. That's a moral choice, and you always choose the good. So this is not about making moral choices. This is discerning between two goods. And as I said, I think oftentimes that's the greater challenge for us. That's where we get more frustrated and concerned, because we have two good ends. How do I know which one God truly desires for me? Well, Ignatius thinks this method of following that one which gives the more of a consolation, that's how God is communicating with us. And so notice how experience and imagination is very important here. And the sense is being aware of those experiences. It's also sort of affectively based, right? It's about your feeling and how your emotional state is at after that kind of reflection. And in fact, the priest of Sacred Heart, that's a key element of their spirituality. Dehonian spirituality has an affective dimension. So does Ignatian spirituality, obviously. Just got done talking about it. But that's one reason why the SCJs say that they're Jesuits of the heart, because they feel like that element of the Ignatian spirituality is more emphasized within their tradition. And that Dehon was trying to reassert or recover that element through his focus on the Sacred Heart of Jesus. You know, that's one way to emphasize the affective element of this discernment process. There's a rational aspect to it too, right? Which I can talk about now, because then Ignatius started to think of some different ways by which you can take this experience and then reflect upon it in a more concrete, tangible way. And let me start with a story before I list all the different ways he offered. The story is about my son, David, my oldest son. And when he was a junior in high school, he set his mind upon going to Boston College. And all we heard about was Boston College, Boston College, Boston College. And in fact, we organized our summer vacation before his senior year to go to the East Coast so he could visit Boston College. And of course, he applied to other schools as well. And we told him, you know what, make sure you apply to the University of Wisconsin-Madison because you need a financial fallback school. And we don't know what kind of financial aid you'll get to some of these private universities, but we do know we can afford Madison. So make sure you apply to that. We never even went to visit it. All right. So what happens? Well, my son does get admitted to Boston College and gets a very nice scholarship package. And he comes to us and says, you know, I've been thinking about it. I think I'd want to go to Madison. We're like, wait, what? You want to go to Madison? You said your criteria were you wanted a school around 10,000 to 12,000 students. Yeah, I know, but, you know, it'd be great to have a bigger population. We said, wait. You told us you wanted to go to the East Coast. You wanted a new culture, get away from the Midwest. Yeah, I know, but, you know, Madison's kind of a happening place. And we said, wait. You said you wanted a Catholic university, and clearly Madison isn't. Yeah, but maybe I should broaden myself. And then we said, wait. Did your girlfriend get into Boston College? Well, no. Did she get into Madison? Yeah, she did. She's going there. Now we know what we're talking about. So what to do? Do we just ban him from going to Madison? Well, what we did instead is we met at Denny's. All great decisions evidently are made in booths at Denny's, we decided. And we sat him down and said, okay, let's talk about this. And we talked about it, and he was very firm that he wanted to go to Mass, and we weren't so sure. So he said, well, let's do this, David. Here, what we want to do is tomorrow you pretend that you've made the decision to go to Boston College. And be aware of sort of how you're feeling about that, in terms of, are you more energized? Do you feel more at peace? Do you feel more balanced? Do you feel more joyful? And then the next day, or rather, do you feel unease? You feel somehow lack of energy, or you feel somehow unmotivated? And then the next day, do the same thing with Madison. Make a decision that you've decided to go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and what are your feelings, whether you're getting what you now know are the feelings of consolation or desolation. Will you do that? Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, and then on the third day, we'll meet back here. Okay, great. So 3 days later, we met back in the same booth at Denny's. We said, did you do what we asked? Oh, yes. Was it helpful? Oh, extremely helpful, yes. Did it clarify your choice? Undoubtedly, yes. So what did you decide? I'm going to go to Madison. And my wife and I looked at him and said, you did it wrong. Do it again. Actually, we didn't say that. We talked about it some more and finally said, well, you seem to have authentically tried to do this. Maybe you are called to go to Madison. And my son will to this day say, I went to Madison for all the wrong reasons, but it was absolutely the right choice. And part of that was that he really had to justify his choice. He studied very hard, very well, which has served him well. He also, along the same vein, had to make some good choices about his time. I think if he went to Boston College, given some of the other friends that were going there, he might have maybe been more involved with the drinking culture, ironically, than going to Madison. But even, maybe most substantially, he there started dating his wife. And through that love, right, he's come to be able to enter more fully into the presence of God in that way too. So, maybe it seems to be how the Spirit was working in his life. Okay, so that's one method, the method of consolation and desolation as a method of discernment. Ignatius, besides what I just described there in terms of one way to do this discernment, he identifies some other that you would have, basically reflect upon these two experiences. And then he recommends a couple things. One, in prayer, you might, first, one method is make a list of positive negatives. We're all sort of familiar with that. But notice he's moving to a rational element to this, not just the affective. But he also, another method is in prayer, pretend you're talking to a good friend or maybe a stranger who has your best interest in mind. Notice sort of a disinterested yet affirming person. And tell them about your experiences, tell them about, in your prayer, how you feel drawn one way or the other in your experiences of reflection, and what advice would they give you? Right. Another method he has is you're on your deathbed and you're looking back over your life. Which of these two choices will you be more happy that you've made? Or fourth method he has would be you've passed and you're in heaven and you're talking to God about your life. We're kind of reviewing your choices. Which of these two choices would give God greater joy? So you can kind of see how he's trying to take those internal experiences and somehow look at them in some sort of objective fashion. I think this is a nice example of what we've talked about over the course of the semester of the connection between faith and reason, right? Clearly, the sense that this is the Spirit that's moving you and present, and there is a desire of God for your life, that's faith. That's faith. But the method by which you assess those experiences and the framework by which you understand those experiences requires the implementation of your intelligence, not just your rational intelligence, but your emotional intelligence, your affective or even physical intelligence in terms of how your body feels about these things. So in that sense, there's a place of reason. I'd also make note that notice how he uses the imagination. Ignatius really thought this was a gift of God, our imaginations, and it was therefore unique to the human, and so therefore a particularly privileged portal into understanding and knowing God. So instead of seeing the imagination, of course, it can be disordered. Your imagination can take you in places you shouldn't go, but in his mind, the imagination was a great tool to come to see God and to understand his will for us. All right, so that's the first discernment technique to enter into the examination of what is God's will for me, the use of the framework of consolation, desolation, and some different techniques to kind of probe that. The second method I want to talk about is the examine. This is a prayer method that St. Ignatius developed when he founded the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. He put in the Constitution that, if circumstances were such that a Jesuit couldn't get to Mass or couldn't say the office or what have you, there's one thing he absolutely had to do every day. And this was a little bit of a break from previous custom, because previous custom would be the office. You have to do the office or the Mass. But no, Ignatius required them to do the examen prayer. This was the one non-negotiable in terms of your daily faith life for St. Ignatius to be a Jesuit. So what is this prayer method that he encapsulates within the spiritual exercises, which is the foundation for the Ignatian spirituality? Well, what he what was involved here with the examen is that this is a daily discernment method, and I like to use an acronym to remember sort of the steps of this daily prayer method, which I call STRIP. And that's an acronym, so each letter stands for a different word, and I'll walk through those. Now, I should probably explain the choice of the word strip. Some people might be a little scandalized by that, thinking, well, wait a minute, this is spirituality. But I think it's actually a very appropriate term, given what Ignatius is going after here with the examen prayer. And maybe I can tell you a little story to make that point. My wife and I, we were focus couples. So for people preparing for marriage, you probably know the focus instrument. It's an inventory that people fill out, and then we would meet with them and go through the inventory. Of course, that inventory is broken up into different topics, right? So you have finances, and you have in-laws, and you have communication, all these different areas that can cause friction or joy within a relationship. And, we compare their answers and make some observations and help maybe them think about how they're going to resolve differences and how they're going to build on strengths. Well, what I always noticed is that I always thought the topic they'd be most uncomfortable discussing with my wife and I would have been the area that dealt with issues of sexuality. And what surprised me was, no, it seemed like most people were more than happy to rattle off their experiences and be very transparent and, maybe a little inappropriate about what they're sharing with us. Too much information coming across the kitchen table there with some of these discussions. And almost so I'd blush at some of the things they were willing to share with us. Then when we got to the area about spirituality, particularly about prayer, it was their turn to blush. You could see them shifting in their chair and feeling uncomfortable. And at first, I was sort of discouraged by that. But then I realized over time, they're right. They're right. The more vulnerable conversation is prayer. Because it's in prayer, if we truly are willing to engage in a deep prayer life, well, we're actually more vulnerable because our soul touches the divine. And if I have to strip away my pretenses, my shallow expectations, my superficial personality and truly touch God at my core. And if I let you see that, well, then it requires a great deal of vulnerability, much more vulnerability than if my skin touches your skin. So this is what Ignatius wants us to do in this prayer, is strip away these pretenses, to allow our self to be fully revealed, not just to God, but to ourselves. And so that's why I use this acronym STRIP. And the S stands for settled. So the first thing you need to do is, be intentional, set some time aside. Prayer does not need to take long, but at least you should have, sort of okay, I'm doing this now, and not just think about this, but you put this within the context of prayer. Maybe take a few deep breaths, kind of settle yourself in a chair or some other appropriate space so that you make this an intentional opportunity to have a conversation with God. So that's the S. The next letter, of course, is T, and that stands for thanks. Ignatius always thinks you need to start prayer with a statement of thanks, from a stance of gratitude. All the great spiritual masters will say that gratitude is the first stance of prayer. Gratitude for the gift of simply being alive. Gratitude for the gifts that God has given you that day. That you need to calibrate this experience of reflecting on your day properly so you can hear how the Spirit might be moving, and therefore, like tuning a radio, you need to tune it into the station of gratitude, to be thankful for all the things that God has given you. And then after thanks, so then we have R. And the R, you can use review of your day as for standing for R, or recollection, or rummaging through your day. I've used different verbs. But the idea here is you let your day sort of unfold in front of you. Some people will talk about this as like looking at your day as a movie. I don't like that analogy because it seems like it holds, you watch a movie. But my understanding from Ignatius is he wants you to sort of re-enter your day. Just let it, let the events sort of spill out, as you will, and you get back enfolded within them. And we do this all the time. I mean, I don't know about you, but I do this just naturally. So he's just taking things we do anyhow, but puts them within the context of a prayer experience, which means a moment to have a conversation with God. So you let those thoughts of the day just sort of kind of wash over you and let them emerge, and you kind of be aware of the feelings that are connected to those, then the I in strip, and the I is interact. And here's where you talk to God. And Ignatius actually suggests you be as concrete as possible. You can talk to God in terms of the Trinity, but he actually recommends you either imagine one of the three persons of the Trinity. So with the Father, you're having this conversation, or Jesus, or the Holy Spirit. We have so this idea that, or even Mary, but you have sort of a concrete conversation about what you just re-experienced. And in particular, talk to God about what were the experiences that bubbled up in terms of consolation. What were the experiences that bubbled up in relation to desolation? So these same two categories we talked about earlier. But just, where did you feel a moment in your life that gave you joy and energized you? Where was a moment in your life that day that discouraged you and left you in dis-ease? And then he says, pick one of those. You just pick one of those, a consolation or desolation, and talk to God about that. And notice, it doesn't always have to be a desolation. We tend to be half glass full people, but it could be more important to reflect upon a consolation moment. And just kind of, walk through, why is that, God? And have a conversation like we might do with a spouse about a great event that happens in the day, or a discouraging event, or a friend, or what have you. And then after you reflect upon that, then you go to the next step, the final step, P, which means plan. And the thought here is sit back and say, well, okay, boy, I had a great experience of consolation today. And that was when I helped this person who, I wasn't really wanting to interrupt my work, but a coworker came and wanted to ask me a question about something, and I was able to really help him or her, and that really gave me a sense of consolation. So therefore, my plan is that next time I get interrupted, I should be more willing to take the time to listen and be helpful. Or maybe the consolation is, I really had a great experience with my kids. We went out and had a good dinner, and maybe, went to the park. And, so maybe my plan is I got to do that more, because it really seemed to help my kids feel more affirmed and more positive. And as a parent, that makes me feel as if I'm fulfilling God's will and basically, deepening my experience of love. Okay, so you can see how that would work with consolation. Of course, maybe it's easier to see on the desolation side. You might pick one event of desolation and, maybe it's this coworker came to me and I was abrupt with him or her, didn't really listen because I was all irritated about my project. It really had nothing to do with what they were saying. Okay, next time I'm feeling pressured and somebody comes for help, I got to remember this and take the time to listen to them, Or maybe, my kids were kind of being rambunctious and I snapped at them and, they probably need to get outside and get some exercise. Okay, next time I'll think of more proactive ways to channel their energy. So you see what you're trying to do is become a person of love, a more loving individual by making an intention in terms of one small thing, right? So you can see how this could work over time. I can give you a story I think I was a beneficiary of a Jesuit who did his nightly examen. This is my first year teaching. I was returned back to my alma mater, which is Creighton Prep High School in Omaha, Nebraska. So Creighton Prep's another Jesuit high school like Marquette High. And I went to a lecture at Creighton University. And the person giving the lecture was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And I thought, boy, I wish my students could hear this, because the next week I was going to talk on this topic. And I thought, if only they could have heard this. And I noticed that there was a Jesuit in the back of the room with his collar on there, and so I assumed he was a Jesuit. And he was videotaping this lecture. So I thought, this is fantastic. How great. If I can get a copy of that videotape, I can use it in class next week. So I went up to the Jesuit, and I am sure, this young, sort of overly excitable teacher. So I probably walked up to him and said, "Oh, golly gee, I saw you videotaping the lecture. Can you get me a copy of that? I want to use it in class next week. I'm a teacher at Creighton Prep. Pat Russell's my name. Would you mind doing that for me?" And he looked at me and said, "I don't have time to plan your class for you." Whoa. Well, I kind of sulked away. And, okay, I guess he told me, right? Next day, I'm at Creighton Prep. My work phone rings. "Hi, this is Father." I won't tell you his name. He's actually a fabulous priest. But anyway, I'm Father blank. Listen, I can't bring the tape to you, but I could make a copy for you. If you want, I could leave it at the front desk of the Jesuit residence here at Creighton University if you wanted to pick that up. Would you like me to do that? I said, "Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much." No problem. I'm happy to help. My guess that night, this priest was doing his examen, went through his day, rummaging through it, and stumbled his toe on me. Oh, gosh. That young teacher from Creighton Prep. What an idiot. Oh. But then again, maybe I didn't respond with the most generous of hearts. I was kind of curt with him. I said kind of a nasty thing. I do have time tomorrow. I can, Lord, make a tape. And it's probably reasonable for me to make it available to him if he's willing to pick it up. I'll call him and ask him if he'd like me to do that. Okay. So you can see how, and in fact, I did get the tape. I used it. It was a great experience for my class. So in fact, that priest, through the exam and prayer, was allowed God's love to seep through the world more fully. So I think about it. I think that in some ways the exam and prayer is similar to what Pope Benedict talked about when he was reflecting upon the nature of Scripture. You remember that quote? I've used it a couple times from Jesus of Nazareth, his writing in that book, where he talks about how Scripture is some ways a retelling of the life of the Jewish people, and that in the retellings, new understandings emerge. Well, really, that's what the exam and prayer is. We retell our day, which is something we do anyway, but we put it within the context of our overall mission in relationship to God's will that we live and love. And in doing that, therefore, new understandings emerge, and a new way in which we are able to love emerges. But it requires some intentionality, requires a desire to truly see God present within our days, to actually believe that God is active through the Spirit in the most mundane of things, even sharp words to a young teacher, or kind words to a loving spouse. All is grace and all is opportunities to encounter the love of God in our lives and to help be a vehicle to spread that more fully in the world, to help build that kingdom of God that God dreams for us. All right, so there you go. That's sort of a coverage of when we want to talk about God's will, and we're certainly doing that. You're doing that as you go through your powerful question. You're really doing an examine in many ways, and you're doing discernment of consolations and desolations within your story. Really, this is what the powerful question process is. It's a chance for you to look at the grand narrative of your life and to identify those moments of consolation and desolation. And now, in the present, to say, what's the movement within the Spirit there of what's one thing that I can pursue, one question that will open me up more to allow me to serve as a vehicle or an instrument of God's grace in the world by being open to what might be the movements of the Spirit within that question. So with that, we'll end this presentation, and we will see you Monday night in class. Take care. Bye.